Hey guys, Chris here with the Good Old Gamer. So we're just a few days away from Computex, and hopefully AMD is going to give us all of the news about Navi and Ryzen 3000 and all of that good stuff. But until then, we've got our hands on some pretty interesting leaks here just this week. And a lot of it is really interesting stuff, so I really wanted to talk about that with you guys because I think Navi is going to end up being different than we all thought. And it definitely looks like AMD is switching their position from the budget manufacturer, and it looks like they might be going for the gold and wanting to be a real competitor to both Intel and Nvidia. Now, I want to start this off. Everything that we're going to be talking about today, these are still kind of leaks and rumors, so take them all with a grain of salt. But we're getting really close to some sort of announcement, so these seem more likely than if they came out a few months ago. Anyway, starting things off, we have Navi apparently coming in at $399 and $499. This is significantly higher than what anybody was expecting from Navi. We were expecting basically half the price. That's what everybody's been saying for a long time now. At these prices, the Sapphire representative said that it'll basically be competing with the GeForce 2060 and the GeForce RTX 2070. Now, that's the part that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, and that's part of the reason why I'm not entirely sure how accurate this really is. However, this is really important news, and I wanted to go ahead and bring this up with you guys. Now, Tom from Moore's Law is Dead, he actually went ahead and did a video yesterday explaining how these prices could make sense, and he made this graph right here. I'm going to put a link to his video in the description below. And I think he touched on a few things that none of the rest of us were really getting. And there's also another part to this that I'm going to go over here in just a little bit that ties in. Okay, so starting things off, essentially, the one thing that I forgot is the special edition, that there's probably going to be a tippity top of the line Navi 10 fully unlocked, and this is going to command a premium. This was originally brought up by Jim from Adored TV as the RX 3080 XT version or whatever. Naming and stuff, I don't know if any of these are right, so I don't really care about that. But apparently there's going to be a really super high-end version that's probably going to be more for the professional market and servers, and it's going to go more to those guys, you know, where AMD can charge $2,000 or $3,000 a pop, but they're probably going to bring this out as a stopgap measure, and I'll explain why having a really high-end or a reasonably high-end Navi close to something like a Radeon 7 would make a lot of sense for them. But the one that Jim had on here as the RX 3080 at 52 compute units, or 3,328 shader cores, this is probably going to be what's going to last, or be the card that we're going to see the most of. And this is what Tom was saying is the RX 3090. Like I said, who knows what the naming's going to be. And this is supposed to be the $399 card. Now, this one, he's saying, should be somewhere around the RTX 2070 level performance and this and that, which is what I have also said. In my video where I was talking about what Nvidia would probably do after Navi launches, I figured RTX 2070 level performance at $399, and then this is how I figured Nvidia would respond to that. Because if you think about it, the RTX 2070 is a $499 to $599 card. So if AMD launches a card that's 20 to 33% cheaper and delivers similar performance, that makes a lot of sense. That would mean that the special edition card here, the fully unlocked core, will likely be 15-20% faster, somewhere in that range, and that would actually compete if Nvidia launches something like a 2070 Ti. Now, we also have news on that. And just yesterday, Nvidia launched their teaser trailer for their new Super Edition cards. And this is something that Tom took into account in his video as well. We all figured they were going to be more Ti cards. That's what I thought. I figured they'd just come out with TIs, and more than likely, this is probably what it's going to be. They'll just replace the 2060, 2070, and 2080 with SE variants, which will be faster, keep those at their regular price, or the price that they are now, and then just drop the price on these guys until they can clear out inventory to go ahead and directly compete with Navi, and then once inventory clears up, then they can go ahead and drop the prices on the SEs. That's my thought. Anything can happen. Who really knows? There's also speculation that the SE versions might actually ditch the RTX cores and instead be something like the 1660 and 1660 Ti, and this would make the dies a lot smaller, a lot cheaper to produce, and possibly even clock higher. So that is another option as well. We're not really sure what this is going to be, but this is obviously Nvidia trying to get ahead of Navi. Now, this second bit of information is actually more important, and this really ties things together. And this is 8 shader engines instead of 4. Now, Paul literally just put out his video on this, and I'll put a link to his video in the description as well. So it's really interesting that both Tom and Paul have kind of the same thought pattern that I have going on, and I find that a little creepy. But anyway, now the biggest problem with GCN is its geometry performance. Now, this is really hard to gauge, and I actually tried finding benchmarks and metrics for this, and I found this article here where they basically just say, figuring out a triangle fill rate is basically just a definition problem, and there's really no reliable benchmark for such a thing because everybody's going to define this differently, so there's really no way to know for sure. However, we do know for a fact that Nvidia's performance on polygons, just generating triangles, is vastly superior to what AMD has. Now, by switching the architecture up, and this is a major architectural change, by the way, so it's not just the same GCN that we've had forever now, this could, in theory, double geometry performance. Now, granted, nothing scales linearly, but it should be a significant increase in geometry performance. And we've heard from AMD executives, from Lisa Su, and other executives that the geometry performance on Navi was the primary focus of what they wanted to address. Now, when you add those two things together, it makes sense for AMD to charge more money because what this means is they're going to be infinitely more competitive than they were before. Now, Steve from Hardware Unboxed, he did this video between the GTX 1060 and RX 580, and this is actually one of the videos that really started clicking all these things together for me. In the video, you can see that now the RX 580 on average is coming out about 2% ahead of the GTX 1060, or the GTX 1060 is 2% slower, either way. But one of the things that you'll notice is there are certain games that favor each architectural type. Each architecture benefits and is stronger in one way over the other. So comparing AMD's current GPUs, like the 580 and the 1060, which is probably the most apples-to-apples comparison you can get, really isn't apples-to-apples at all, because they do different things. For example, looking at the RX 580, it's a 6.175 teraflops, compared to 4.375 teraflops on the GTX 1060. So what this tells us is the RX 580 is far more shader heavy. Okay, you can clearly see that. 2304 compared to 1280. I mean, that's a massive difference, which means the games that AMD performs better in are more shader heavy games. And this is something that we're starting to see more and more of. I was watching Digital Foundry's video on Rage 2, and John Linneman in this video, he was saying how he really likes all of this post-processing effects, and he really likes, the motion blur and all of that kind of stuff. And to me, when I was playing Rage 2, I noticed that it was a pretty blurry game. And for me, I don't personally like that as much. He does, so this is more of a personal preference thing. But that's where the difference is coming into play. Newer games are becoming more shader heavy, more post-processing heavy, and that's where the workload's going, and they're becoming more geometry basic or limited in geometry. So that's the main reason why you see such a stark difference between AMD and Nvidia on the Pascal versus Polaris generation, because they do two completely different things. They're not really an apples-to-apples comparison. They're both graphics cards, but the AMD cards focused more on compute, and the Nvidia cards focused more on geometry and gaming, essentially. So that's where the divide happened. Now, assuming that this leak is true and AMD has solved their geometry problem and massively increased its geometry performance, that means that their cards are going to be far more on par with Nvidia's cards. Now, going back to Tom's chart here, and this is where something like the Special Edition 3090 or whatever they're going to call it, the fully unlocked Navi 10 could command a premium because it's going to probably be really, really close to the Radeon 7 in performance. And at $499, even if it's 5 to 10% slower, it's still significantly cheaper. Now, the thing is if we also get the better geometry engine in here, that means this card, and maybe even this card, and possibly even this card, might actually outperform the Radeon 7 in very geometry-heavy games. Games with a lot of tessellation, and games particularly from the 2015, 2016, and even the 2017 era. Now, in 2018, we really kind of saw games shift a lot of focus on becoming very shader and post-processing heavy, and that's when we started to see AMD cards really overtake Nvidia's Pascal cards. So on older games, these cards might actually outperform the Radeon 7 and deliver a really, really good value if you think about it, even at $499. Now on shader-heavy games, it might even balance out because of the extra geometry performance, might balance out with the lack of shader performance. Unsure, but let's say this comes in 5 to 10% slower than a Radeon 7. Is $499 too much money? And that's what Tom was trying to say in his video, and I agree that kind of makes sense. But making it a limited edition card until Navi 20 is ready also makes a lot of sense, because it kind of fills in that gap there where it's plenty powerful and it's not something that AMD wants to keep around for long. The card that's probably going to stick around throughout the whole generation will be this one right here. And it makes a lot of sense because it's a cut down die, which means that they can get better yields, which means they can sell them for less money and make more profit. Taking a look at AMD's first quarter financials for 2019, the big news here is their gross margins are up to 41%. And this is 5% above year over year. And if we go on in here to gross margins, it's even up 3 points quarter to quarter. So from the previous quarter to this quarter. AMD is trying to get this 41% margin up to 45% by the end of the year, which means that they're not going to be selling their stuff at cost anymore. They need to make profit, and as a company that is going to be leading the way in the CPU department, they will be the industry leader in server CPUs and desktop CPUs here in the not too distant future. And why not, shoot for the moon on that? Now, will they be able to beat Nvidia straight out? Probably not. But are they going to be ultra competitive and far more competitive than they ever were? I think so. Alrighty guys, I threw a lot of information at you, and because we're going to be getting more concrete information on Navi, I didn't want to go too deep into any one thing at this point, but there's a lot of separate videos built into that I just kind of vomited at you that I'm going to want to do once we get more definitive information from AMD. Because the biggest thing here is, we saw what Turing did. Turing took the shader performance, Pascal down here, AMD was down here, and they leveled it out. They leveled the playing field on shader performance, and AMD no longer holds that advantage. So now Nvidia has both geometry and shader performance advantage with their Turing cards. So what'll happen when AMD bumps up their geometry? It'll be a more level playing field overall. That means older games will run the same or similarly, and everything's going to be just more level. There's going to be less of a reason to pick one brand over the other because you're not going to have that big gap. You're not going to have the Nvidia game running so much better than the AMD game because the architectures are becoming much, much more similar. This is also one of the reasons why I believe they invested so heavily in ray tracing, because Nvidia's probably knew what was coming with Navi and realized they're going to be losing that geometry advantage, so they needed another advantage. And why not do ray tracing? Now, the thing with ray tracing is it doesn't really matter to consumers here today. It's not that big of a deal. It's not in programs. It's not really in games that we play. Now, will it become a thing in the future? I think it will be, and I'm going to do a video on that later on, but I don't think it's going to be this big, massive, super important, everybody needs it kind of a thing, not for a long time. I think it's basically just going to be like using ultra quality settings versus high, and most people are still good with just high today, and they will be in the near future. Eventually, when all graphics cards have dedicated ray tracing hardware, that's when games will start using it, and that's when it'll matter. So good on Nvidia for at least, starting that, but I don't think it really matters that much to me or you here today, and it's definitely not worth paying a premium for. But at the very least, they're trying to have an advantage over AMD. And if they lose their geometry advantage, it's just going to be whoever's cheaper. Because at that point, it's not going to matter. The 7 nanometers is really going to make up the difference between efficiencies and architecture, and may even give AMD a little bit of a lead at the very low end. Because if they can get like RX 580 level performance at 75 watts, that's much better than the GTX 1650. So that kind of tells you that their architecture on 7 nanometers is probably going to be more efficient at the lower end. And when Jim was saying that Navi might not be as good as we think, I believe that's because it's not as efficient on the high end. Clocks will be a little bit higher, and to get that, they're probably having to push up voltage a little bit more, and it's using more power, and that's the reason why it might not be up to what AMD hoped it would be, or not what they were seeing on the lower end with the Navi 12s. Either way, this is all speculation, but if you link all this stuff together, AMD is no longer wanting to be considered second tier. Like I said, they're going to have the superior CPU here in just a couple of days. They're going to announce that. We already know that they can beat an i9 9900K at lower power. So, okay, we already know that they've won on that front. Now, by leveling the playing field with Nvidia and just leaving them ray tracing as their only real advantage, then it's just going to come down to price to performance. And it looks like they're going to deliver better price to performance than Nvidia has, and that's the reason why we're getting the super versions of cards or special editions or whatever the hell they're going to call them. More than likely, those are coming out just to kind of give you a little bit more performance while trying to hold on to whatever price points that they have. Nvidia does not like lowering their prices. They would rather phase out the base models, the regular 2060, 2070, and 2080, maybe even the 2080 Ti, and replace those with something else so they can justify dropping the price on you on those, lowering the prices because they're phasing them out. They're trying to clear inventory and hold on to the price points that they currently have. Not sure what's going to happen there, but just knowing Nvidia, that's probably the way that they're going to go. They might keep a few of those lower tier cards just to fill in some gaps if they need to. But at the end of the day, as long as AMD brings better price to performance, that's good for us. It's just not going to be what I think we were thinking, but I think we're going to get better performance than we were thinking. Now, if they really can double the geometry performance or 1.5 times or whatever it works out to be on the scaling, there's no more advantage to Nvidia. The games that run really well on Nvidia cards are going to run just as well on AMD cards, and vice versa. And the really crazy thing is like I said, the higher end cards might actually beat the Radeon 7 in games that are really geometry heavy. If you look at most of the games that launched in 2015, they're pretty much all geometry heavy. They're not nearly as post-processing heavy as games are today. Games today are so post-processing heavy, and that favors AMD hardware. It makes sense because that's what's in consoles. And to utilize all that power and get all these cool graphics effects, just do it on the post-processing. The shader power is there to handle it, and it makes the game look good. But at the same time, it does make the game look a little bit blurry. And that's something I want to do its own video on. And I believe underlying the whole thing, the main reason why games are looking more blurry is because more post-processing, because AMD hardware is the standard for game consoles and all of that stuff. Well, anyways, sorry guys, this is, like I said, this is a lot of stuff. I'm throwing it at you. I really want to hear your thoughts on this. I'm really excited. We'll know more in a few days, but I think this makes a lot of sense. I think we're going to have a more competitive market on the GPU side than we were expecting. I'm really hoping that leak was right. Then doubling the geometry engines is a major, major win. And this means that this version of GCN is incomparable to any of the others. It's just not. You can't compare it to it because this is a major overhaul. So it might be GCN based, but it's not really GCN anymore. That's just my opinion on it, but hopefully that's right. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. If you like this video, please hit that like button, please subscribe, please share with friends. That really helps me out. And if you want to help support the channel and help me make more content like this, please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. $1 a month helps me make videos like this, and I can get more stuff on hands and make really, really cool content for you guys. And thank you to everybody who has supported the channel. So that's all I've got for today, and I will catch you guys in the next video.